Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I know that some of you found the title in the Shabbat flyer for this morning's sermon interesting, to say the least, because some of you already emailed me. And as for those of you who haven't read the flyer yet, the title actually is, "Would the correct version of the Ten Commandments please stand up?" I'm sure that you all would agree that the Ten Commandments, as we read this morning, are the core and essential commandments of Judaism. They are one of the foundational pillars upon which the most, not only Judaism, but the most civilized societies of the world are built. Now, the rabbis teach that the Ten Commandments are the executive summary of all the 613 mitzvot, the Taryag mitzvot. They say that every commandment can be viewed as connected to one of the Ten Commandments. For example, all the sacrifices, what are they? They are the modern, they are substituted by prayer, which is our modern way of recognizing the sacrifices of the temple times. A way of demonstrating our obedience to the second commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me." And given the great importance that is attached to the Ten Commandments, you would think that there would be no question as to what exactly we are being commanded. And therefore it seems very strange that there are actually two different versions of the Ten Commandments. One that we read today, in this week's Torah reading, Yisro, and a different version that is found in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, some of the differences are small, and perhaps we could sort of explain it by lazy scribes, such as the fact that in this week's reading, the commandments not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal are clearly written separately, line by line. You actually can see it in your Chumash. Whereas in the book of Deuteronomy, between each word there is a vav, which means, and you shall not steal, and you shall not commit adultery, and you shall not murder, indicating that it was actually one long sentence, or that they're somehow connected. But some of the differences are much too big to be attributable to sloppy scribes. Now, both versions contain the commandments regarding Shabbat, but what we're being commanded in each are actually quite different. In the version from our parsha of this morning, we are commanded, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, to remember the Shabbat day. And in the book of Deuteronomy, the commandment is Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, to guard or to keep the Shabbat day. So which is the real, the authentic commandment? Now, the version of the Shabbat commandment in this week's Torah reading ties Shabbat to creation. We rest on Shabbat because, why? Because God rested on the Shabbat, okay? The version in Deuteronomy doesn't refer to creation at all. It actually refers to the Exodus from Egypt, and it tells us to remember the Shabbat day because God took us out from there with a strong and outstretched arm, etc., etc. There are also differences in some of the details. For example, in this week's reading, we are told, "No labor shall be performed by our beasts." And in Deuteronomy, it spells out, "Your ox, your donkey, your livestock shall perform no labor." So the rabbis give a very mystical explanation to remember and keep. As we sing in the Lachad Dodi, we sang together last night, we said, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. Keep and remember with one word. That God somehow magically said the two words are the same. He said it at the same time in a way that people could understand. Now, that might be okay for explaining those two words, but what about all the other differences? And there are significant differences in the commandments to honor your father and your mother. And the final commandment, the commandment not to covet, where Deuteronomy has a more comprehensive list of the things that we're not supposed to covet. How are we to understand these significant differences in what's one of the most sacred sections of our most sacred text? And the differences are too big to be explained by scribal error. Even if we were to accept that the scribes of the time could get something wrong on such an important section of the Torah, this is too large for it to fall into this category. And the sages of the Talmud and Midrash already struggled with the question. One approach in the Midrash says that the version in this week's parasha is the version that was written on the first set of tablets that Moses smashed after the children of Israel sinned with the golden calf. And that the version in the book of Deuteronomy is what was on the second set of tablets after Moses went back up the mountain. But this idea does not appear to make much sense. Both were supposed to be the recordings of what God had said at Sinai. Now another idea takes off in the Midrash that says, before God gave the Torah to Israel, he offered the Torah to all the nations of the world. Now Rabbi Shlomo Ephraim Lunchitz says the first version is what God was offering the other nations, and the version in Deuteronomy is the version that God actually gave to the children of Israel. But this explanation again has the same problem as the previous explanation. Both versions are supposed to be a record of what God at Sinai, what God said once. Now, some commentators come to the problem from a very different angle. The book of Deuteronomy, they say, is different than the first 4 books of the Torah. The entire book of Deuteronomy is really one great, big, long speech that Moses gave. His parting words. And therefore, what's in Exodus are the actual words of God that were spoken at the revelation on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai. And what's in the book of Deuteronomy is the version that Moses shared in his final discourse, given from his memory. And so perhaps he was paraphrasing, or perhaps he wanted to emphasize different features. And yet, another approach is suggested by Rabbi Joshua Berman, who I actually spoke about, if you remember, last week on another matter. He's an Orthodox rabbi and professor at Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv. Rabbi Berman says that we have to read the Torah in the context in which it was written. We can't look at it the way we look at contemporary literature. Now, if you look at the Torah, much of it is similar to vassal treaties between kings that were very common in antiquity. It was typical that in such vassal treaties, there would be sort of a recounting of the history between the peoples. And if there was a renewal of the treaty at a later date, then that history might be recounted differently because the more powerful king wants to emphasize different things at the later time. The political context changes. And so it is natural that the story changes. Now, in his view, Rabbi Berman's view, the version in Exodus that we read today was earlier. The version in Deuteronomy was years later, as Moses giving his final testament. And the needs of the people to hear certain things because of the experiences that they lived changed. It's perfectly natural. Modern scholars, using biblical criticism and what we call the critical review of sacred text, their approach say that two different versions represent different oral traditions. Different oral traditions that were handed down, that were eventually redacted into a single written book in the form that we have today. And that was done during the days of the prophet Ezra in the 5th century BCE. Now it's interesting that the Talmud says Ezra restored the text of the Torah to its original state because it had become corrupted. Talmud tells us this. And modern scholars date the Torah text to that same time period based on linguistic analytics of the Hebrew. Because by the time we get to Ezra, the Hebrew had actually changed. Now, according to the documentary hypothesis first formulated by scholars in the 19th century, there are different strands in the Torah that represent the work of different authors or groups of authors. And this is most readily seen in the opening chapters of the Torah. There are actually two versions of the creation story. For example, in one version, men and women are created at the same time. And in the other version, we have, of course, the very familiar story of Adam and Eve, and Adam was lonely, so God created a companion from taking his rib. So one version of the creation story may have been popular in the south, and the other version was popular in the north. And then when the Torah was brought into final form, both needed to be included. Now, why did they both need to be included? Because if you left one version out, people who were familiar with the other version would say, well, that's not the way my bubby taught us the story. And so the editors skillfully wove both versions together to give us the final form that we have today. Now, some, of course, reject this approach because they say that if there were human editors involved in the process, it removes the Torah from divine authorship. And some people say, why should we care about it if it was just written down by people? I suggest that that is the wrong attitude. I believe that at the heart of the Torah, there is wisdom from God, but people have had input as well. The Torah, therefore, is what I consider to be a partnership between man and God. We are God's partners in making this world a better place. And God is our partner on our quest for personal growth and development. And where do we meet? We meet together in the Torah. And with that, I wish you all Shabbat Shalom.